Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Taylor, and today we are going to dive into a topic we've never talked about on the podcast before. So I'm excited to open up a new conversation, and I'm also very, very excited to share the guest for today, Farzana Doctor. And I actually was introduced to her through my Ph.D. program at Modern Sex Therapy Institute. And she came and she taught over the weekend, and it was so fantastic. And, you know, again, always going into like education with an open mind, open heart, open ears. And I thought, wow, okay, this is definitely someone I need to get on the podcast to continue this conversation and to share some of the things that I've learned and share the stories as well. So before I share the interview, I want to tell you a little bit about our guest. She is a writer, an activist, and a psychotherapist. She has written several books that I highly recommend that you check out. Her most recent one is called 7. All of the resources that are mentioned in today's episode will be listed in our episode notes, so be sure to check that out. She creates poetry, so she has a poetry collection. She does a ton of activism within this space, and want to encourage everyone listening, as always, listen with an open heart, open ears, open mind, and also make sure to take care of yourself. Today's episode is going to be focused on female genital mutilation, which is a very unspoken about topic. It's a topic I don't think we hear a lot about. It's a topic that can trigger a lot of discomfort, a lot of fear, a lot of pain. For any survivors listening, I hope that you do take a second to care for yourself however you need to. I hope that you find support and healing through this episode. And for those who are listening, I hope that you are able to learn about what this experience can be like, can learn a little bit about how to be an ally here, and some tools for how to be an activist in this space as well. So let's talk about it. All right. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time and being open to coming and joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about these issues.
Yeah. I mean, just from your presentation, during my class with Modern Sex Therapy Institute over the weekend, I was just like, oh, wow, like this is definitely a topic that people don't hear a lot about. And when they do, I feel like it's very stigmatized and there's a lot of like misinformation. So super happy to see that we were having a course on this and loved how you presented everything. And one thing that I actually learned from a previous presenter that I've been kind of mulling over, and that I'm like, actually, I think I want to do this like on every podcast now. I love the idea of starting off these interviews with kind of introducing our identities. So I was wondering if you could just share a little bit of like the identities that you hold, just so that we all have an idea of how you're showing up to the space and have context to who you are as a human.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. So I'm a 50-year-old cis woman living in Toronto. My ethno-racial background is that I am South Asian. My parents are originally from India, and we belong to the Dawoodi Bohra community, or that was the community that I was born into. And that's a Shia subsect, very insular, small community. I also identify as a queer woman. I'm a psychotherapist and an activist, and I'm a novelist as well. Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the book 7, but you've written several books and won a ton of different awards. Can you speak a little bit about your experience with, doing the work of being a writer?
Yeah, I think I've been a writer my whole life, but, because I come from an immigrant background where security is a really important thing, I kind of moved away from that and looked for a career that would be secure. And I'm glad I did. I enjoy being a psychotherapist. I think of it as really sacred work. And so, in the mornings I write. I've been writing in a kind of more disciplined way for about 20 years. And I've written 4 novels that have been published. And I've got a couple more books on their way in the next couple of years. And I find it's a really great balance. While I love being a therapist, it's nice to have a dedicated creative practice that, and I mean dedicated in the sense that I actually kind of put, a few hours each day into it. So it kind of creates a balance. I think it can be hard to be constantly working with trauma. So it's nice to be able to have a place to put some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very disciplined. I'm trying to think of the things that I do disciplined every day, and I'm struggling to name one other than like feed my cat.
I'm glad for your cat. Yeah, I think it's my personality. I've always been somebody who likes a calendar. And initially when I started writing, I was writing in these short spurts where I could steal time. And because I started writing novels in a space of scarcity, I think now I pretty much stick to my writing routine now that I have more time for it.
Yeah. And can you speak to that of writing out of scarcity?
Yeah. So, initially I had, one of those jobs at a hospital, probably working 50 hours a week, feeling pretty burnt out. And so writing was, during holidays, and holidays you're supposed to be resting, weekends, a little bit of here and there in the morning. And so it was fine. A lot of people write that way because, we have to. But it makes for difficulties with immersion into the characters, into the story, if you can't be in it a little bit longer. So it's nice to have more time and space for it today.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of work in our culture is based in scarcity, and the way that our systems are set up creates an environment full of this feeling of scarcity and this pressure to produce that can be quite stressful.
Really stressful because we do have to, make money. And, I live in Toronto, which is a very expensive city to live in.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for my psychotherapy practice.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do as a psychotherapist? It sounds like you started off maybe working in community mental health, like in a hospital setting. Wondering what your experience has been with being a psychotherapist.
Yeah, I did start. I started actually in small agencies, moved into a hospital setting over the years. And I'm a person who doesn't like having a boss. And I was struggling with whether I could continue in, fairly hierarchical, oppressive, homophobic, racist environments. And so I moved into private practice, and it has worked so much better for me. And it also allows me to structure my day so that I can do my writing in the morning, see the clients in the afternoon, and just have more autonomy.
Yeah. And would you say there's a specific population of folks that you do work with in your private practice?
So primarily I would say it's a mix. It's definitely a mix, but I have racialized clients primarily, as well as queer and trans clients. And, trauma is such a common experience, trauma used in a kind of broad sense. So I do a lot of work around that. And one of my favorite forms of therapy these days is internal family systems work. I really love that. And I really love hypnosis as well.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I'm just wondering a little bit here how, I think people these days, at least maybe mainstream or maybe just on social media, are talking more about, decolonizing therapy and about, breaking down the elements of white supremacy that are kind of entangled in the work of therapy and in the history of this work. So I'm wondering if you do have any thoughts or any things to share around how in a way maybe you decolonize your therapy practice.
It's definitely a work in progress, right? Because I'm still learning, and that's a process that's happening inside of me all the time. But it's just having an awareness that, oppression impacts us in so many different ways. And we have to be looking out for that in a client's story. And I think the other piece is how you use yourself in the work. So, understanding that there's quite a lot of power that you hold as a therapist. This is a very vulnerable emotional space for clients. So, understanding where you might be overstepping and, making corrections around that can be important too. Yeah. The other thing with private practice, because we are charging people money, some people have extended, insurance plans that cover it or cover some of it. But so many people don't have access. And in Canada, our mental health system is really inadequate. Waiting lists are huge and long, and then often you end up in hospital settings that are really oppressive, so they don't work very well for people. Yeah. So we have to think a lot about our fees and sliding scales as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, I think, has been at the core of me being in private practice, is just this really strong mission of it has to be affordable. Majority of people I see at a low sliding scale rate. And that's, I think, on one hand, there's that saying of, we don't get into it for the money, we don't get into being a therapist for the money. But at the same time, we do spend a lot of money on our schooling. We often go into a lot of debt in order to get all the licensures and the education in order to do this work. And, have to also...
We don't want to devalue our work at the same time. It is this funny tightrope I find for people of, we want to value our work and our time. This is often mental health work, especially work that's done by women, is considered to be devalued, right? Yeah. So we want to value the work, but on the other hand, we don't want to be overcharging.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fine balance there. But that's also the benefit of diversifying your income, which it sounds like you've also done. All right. We're going to take a short break right here. I want to share a lovely sponsor of the podcast, a company that I love so much and I'm just so thrilled to have as a partner on this podcast. And that is Bellesa. And I know we talk a lot about sex on this podcast, and we also talk about porn. We also talk about, the ways in which our porn is not always comfortable, the ways in which our porn sometimes leaves us feeling kind of icky and guilty. And I'm really excited to share with y'all that Bellesa has a new little section of their platform called Bellesa Plus, which is essentially the Netflix of porn, because people want better porn and people want ethical porn. And Bellesa is you know what? We're going to give you both. So right now they are offering and empowering you to choose what you want to pay for porn. No catch. That's it. And Bellesa is a woman-owned and woman-ran company, which I love. So the porn focuses on real, genuine connection and emphasizes female pleasure. There's no these fucked up ads and no fake orgasms. It is the only porn company where female performers choose who they want to have sex with for their scenes. I just absolutely love everything Bellesa does, from their toys to their education and their blogs to now the Netflix of porn with Bellesa Plus. So just head over to bellesaplus.co/Taylor. Choose what you want to pay and enjoy Bellesa's porn, erotica, and sex education guilt-free. It's the last thing we need in our sex lives, in our sexuality, is guilt. Let's throw it out the window. None of that here. Bellesa Plus offers 100% discreet billing. You can also pause or cancel with one click at any time. That's bellesaplus.co/Taylor. Pay what you want for the Netflix of porn and join the ethical porn movement. With that, we can now get right back to the episode. So I would love to transition a little bit here into this topic of female genital mutilation that you cover a lot and that you do a lot of work in and a lot of activism in. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of how you got into the activism in this space of female genital mutilation?
The activism came out of trying to sort out my own experience of being a victim of it. So back in 2015, this amazing activist named Massima Rinaldi put out this article. It was a first person experience article. And it was the first time that I had ever seen that in India, the mainstream media took up the issue. Oh, wow. And so that article got circulated and I saw it on Facebook and I contacted her on Facebook Messenger and just sort of said like, thank you so much. And I just knew I was full of feeling. I was actually probably dysregulated when I wrote that email to her. But she invited me to take part in a WhatsApp group that evolved into the organization. And so it was a learning curve because I was trying to figure out my own self-care. What did this mean to me? What exactly had happened to me? What did it mean to be part of this community? And for the first while, I stayed very much in the background. I'm the Twitter handler. I'm part of a steering committee, that kind of thing. And because I'm a novelist, these kinds of things often, whatever my current struggle is, finds its way into the writing in some form. And I had experiences where I'd be sitting down with my morning cup of coffee and these fully formed fictional scenes were just arriving. And so as I continued to write the novel and I realized that I would need to be, promoting it, I would need to start talking about it more and more. And I had to center myself in this whole issue and the story. And so I worked really hard. I did a lot of healing work. I practiced, doing interviews about this so that I could feel calm talking about these issues and being out as a survivor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm wondering for you, it sounds like you were able to do a lot of that healing work as you were kind of stepping into a space of activism. And I imagine that you said something that's really sticking out to me is you said you were full of feeling and imagining just how powerful that would have been for you to experience. But everything in your life up until seeing that article, was there healing for you before that? And if so, what did that look like?
There hadn't been any healing before that because this is an issue that doesn't get talked about at all in our community and in many of the communities that practice this because it's taboo, it's trauma, it's secretive. And so it hadn't been something that I had ever really processed before. And so as the activism was starting, I was having the body memories, I was having the nightmares, I was having trauma sequelae, right? So then that was the moment where I was like, yeah, this really did happen to me. And the bits and pieces of the story are coming forward. So often these memories are implicit and much of it was implicit, but I was starting to get these little bits and pieces, I think of it sometimes like a jigsaw puzzle and lots of pieces are missing and that's okay. But some of the pieces were beginning to make sense and I was able to create a narrative around it. So a lot of the healing came because of distress, nightmares and body memories and freeze responses during sex, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before we get any more into this, because I super appreciate you sharing that. And there's so much more in that I want to unpack here. But I also want to make sure that listeners have kind of an idea of what it even is that we're talking about. Because like you said, this doesn't get talked about a lot. So I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through a little bit of what female genital mutilation is. I'm going to start saying FGM for the rest of the podcast now, so I don't have to say this in the long version. But of what FGM looks like are there different types? How does this actually happen?
So first, people need to understand it's a form of gender-based violence. It's on the whole continuum of gender-based violence that, contains things like rape culture and, body policing. So it's a form of that. And then there are 4 different kinds. And so all across the planet, the main reason that is given for this happening is to police sexuality, to control sexuality. And it's a myth. You can't really control a person's sexuality by cutting their genitalia. But that's sort of how it's talked about. And the secondary reason that's given is for belongingness. So it can be kind of an initiatory rite in a community.
This sounds very similar to circumcision as well
Yes.
here. Just that last piece there, the belonging.
Yes. There's a lot of similarities, and maybe we can talk about that in a minute. So there are 4 kinds that range anywhere from a cut to the clitoral hood, which is what happens in my community, to cutting the clitoris, to removal of the external labia, to creating, like, stitching the labia together and leaving a small hole, to other forms like cauterization, burning, piercing, so on. So there's a full range, and I would encourage people to just go and Google the World Health Organization. They have images there that they can have a look at. But people need to know there's no standardization, because this is a practice that's done primarily by amateur cutters, by female amateur cutters. It's the men in the community that make the rules usually, but it's the women who enforce them. And so, because it's often happening under duress, the child can be in fight or flight, which means that, the cut is going to look different than if someone was in freeze or fawn, right? So there's no standardization, but there are these 4 categories. And it's thought to be happening in 92 countries across the world. Until about 5 years ago, people were talking about it only happening in 32 countries. And the myth is that it primarily only happens in Africa.
Yeah.
But we know that it happens everywhere. So everywhere except Antarctica. We've been hearing more and more survivors coming forward from, say, Russia, from Colombia, from the U.S., white Christian women in the U.S. talking about this happening to them. So it's a global phenomenon, and the very limited statistics that we have suggest that there's about 200 million survivors, and that it happens every 10 seconds. I think the number is low because the governments across the world haven't been that interested in collecting statistics about gender-based violence in general, right?
Yeah. Oh, makes my heart feel so heavy just thinking about that every 10 seconds and probably more than that.
Yes, it's this unnecessary trauma, right?
Yeah. And I mean, first of all, I'm wondering what's going on in Antarctica. Why are they, how do we take on their practices here of not having this as a practice? Yeah, I think it is important how you said, that there's no standardization here. And I think people do kind of have this assumption that it's like, oh, it looks this one way, or, that it's a practice that looks very similar for everyone, because I think that's also our, for the most part, our conception of male circumcision, which is talked about more, I would say. It's more normalized and has sort of this like proudness to it that like if you're not, like, you're dirty and you're unclean and all these other things that like could be a whole other episode, but that there is that little bit of a difference there. And I mean, I'm wondering too here, you said this in the presentation, and literally, I don't remember if my video was on or not, but I was like doing snaps. I was like, oh, yes, thank you, name it. Where you were like, this is gender-based violence. This is a gender-based practice, and it's because of a culture of patriarchy. And I was like, thank you. You named it.
And patriarchy is bad to children, even male-bodied children. And so that's where some of the similarities to circumcision on babies who were, assigned male at birth, that's where that's also really problematic, right? Because it's about bodily autonomy and lack of consent and, the potential for trauma.
And I mean, I was even kind of considering, well, yes, this is female-based, and I guess I'm wondering where this does happen. if there is fluidity in gender, if someone has a clitoris, but they aren't, presenting as one would assume a woman would in that culture, or, if they are working on transitioning, like how would this still happen with them? Would they still be considered to receive this practice? Yes. I don't even want to say surgery, but would they still, become victims of this practice if they aren't necessarily falling in line with the binary of being a woman?
Yeah. Well, we have a real gap in knowledge when it comes to non-binary and trans people. Mm-hmm. And we know that that there have to be survivors with those identities too. They don't get talked about very much. And unfortunately, at the end, FGM movement doesn't include them, which is a problem. So, I would imagine, because this mostly happens to minors, right? So it's happening to kids in my community. It happens around the age of 7, plus or minus a few years. So 7. If a kid is, it's young, right? Tiny. Yeah. So, when a child is non-binary, I think they're probably just as likely to fall victim to this. And then they have, much bigger problems to deal with because our culture doesn't, yet support non-binary people, right?
Yeah. Well, so for a 7-year-old child or girl, person with a clit, experiencing this, you noted that it's the women who carry out this practice. And I'm wondering how that creates or how that impacts the relationships with women within the communities where this happens.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I like to quote Muna Al-Tahawi whenever I can, because she's amazing. So she talks about how women are often the foot soldiers of the patriarchy in so many realms, right? Yeah. So this would be another one of those situations where that happens. So, if you think about, in other societies where this is not practiced, there can be other forms of this, like women will often, police and harm other women in so many different ways in any culture, regardless of FGM, right? Yeah. We fat shame, we will undercut, where we can experience jealousies in strange ways, all of that. So think of it in that generalized way. And then in this community, so what happens is our religious leader says, this is required, this is harmless, this will make your girl good. And if you believe in him and if you love him, you'll say, well, he must be telling us the correct thing. So think of that. You're a mom or you're a grandma and you're like, oh, I guess it's okay. But it happened to you too. You're also a victim of it. But maybe you dissociated the experience, or maybe you're really confused about the experience because you also get gaslit. You're told nothing really happened and don't cry and like, what's the big deal? And don't talk about it. So you can be in a state of like fog yourself as you're being obedient to the religious leader. And then you'll just continue the practice. So these are women who are not monsters. Yeah. They just don't know that it's harmful. Now, I have to say that after 5 years of activists educating them, if they're denying the harm, that's another story. But the vast majority of people have never talked about it. And what I've heard from people who have read my book, who are from this community, they've said things like, for the first time I talked to my mom about it, to my cousins who went with me for the Khatna, first time I've even dealt with my own trauma around it. So this is sort of how it all unfolds.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you're open at all to sharing how your activism, how you're speaking out about this has impacted your relationships with the women in your life within your family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have a family that is quite diverse in the sense that there are people who are very conservative and orthodox, and then people who are way on the other end of things. And so it's the people who are the least observant and orthodox who have been very supportive.
Yeah.
It's still difficult to talk about these issues with them because it's a trauma and it's a taboo. People will want to change the subject.
Yeah.
But they'll say kind things. They'll say, we're proud of you. And I'm part of, an activist community of, feminist women who are really supportive and kind to me. So, in some ways it's brought me a little closer to people. And as I was learning about these issues, it sort of made me want to move even further away from some of the conservative Orthodox people who I didn't have a lot of in common with anyway in my family. And those people are in denial. They're not willing to listen to the information. And one thing I just want to add, because I am speaking about my own community, and this does happen in the context of religion, but it's not a religious practice. It's not considered to be a cultural practice because it is happening so universally. It happens to pagans and Christians and Muslims, and most religious leaders are saying that this shouldn't be happening. So it's very few religious leaders who are like our religious leader. And I have often described them as like people who are kind of fringy religious leaders who will say that it's a religious practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you to kind of speak about some of the myths around FGM. And I think you just kind of touched on one right there. And it is, I think, imagined, right, that this is like in Africa and that's only where it happens, or like only within this really particular subset of religious peoples, right? And I mean, this is where, again, I love that you're like, this isn't really a part of like any like specific culture. It's because of a culture of patriarchy. And that is like world. And that's why I'm like, what's going on in Antarctica? Like, do they have some kind of different system other than patriarchy? How are they working up there? Because yeah, it does seem like the purpose in it is to regulate and have control over women's sexuality.
Yeah.
Which is a threat, which is actually a threat to patriarchy.
Yes. And that's a worldwide phenomenon. Somehow people buy into the myth that sexuality is something that is a threat and needs to be controlled. Something I want to mention is there are some groups out there that want to maintain this practice because they believe it's their right or it's part of their culture or they think it's part of their religion. And they will tell anyone who's outside of that culture and religion, you're not allowed to touch this. You're not allowed to touch it. You're being racist. Oh. And I just want to say that really push up against that, because in every community you will find the feminists who are saying the opposite. So in my community, we have a couple of activist groups, and then we have this very well-funded, very toxic group that is pushing to maintain, in air quotes, their religious right to maintain the practice. So in every community, you'll find some of those people who are continuing to be the foot soldiers of the patriarchy. So we do say it's a social norm. It's a social norm that can be changed. You know, we've changed all kinds of social norms, to become healthier, better people.
Yeah. How do you see a path towards changing this? Is this something where folks need to be enacting laws for there to be consequences for those who practice it, or for those who, since it also sounds like, again, the primarily women who are doing the procedures are victims and survivors themselves, that it's like a generational trauma. It's a victimized violator, right? Like they're someone who is oppressed in some way, who is also then continuing in some form of suppression or harm. What does that like? do we focus on holding them accountable in some way?
Yeah.
Is it the folks who have like power who are, talking about this and encouraging it? How do you see working towards a change in working to eliminate or reduce these practices?
Yeah. In Canada, one of the things that we're really pushing our government for, and it hasn't happened yet, is a national action plan to address this. So it pulls in all of the different areas. So it's like legal. So it is illegal here. And in many, many countries, it is illegal. Mm-hmm. In the US, it's illegal. So you need the law enforcement, but it can't just be law enforcement. It needs to be teachers kind of watching out for some signs. It needs to be the social workers. It needs to be child protection. It needs to be within, and I think this is actually the most powerful, within each community. We have to have culturally appropriate ways within each community to talk about this. So groups like We Speak Out, which I'm part of, our social media campaigns will have education and information for us. Groups like SIO in the U.S. That is also part of the Dawoodi Bohra community have these discussion groups. Before COVID, they would sit together and eat together and then, raise a number of different issues, including Khatna, which is what we call FGM. Mm-hmm. So it's through talking and sharing and opening the conversations and broaching the difficult conversations. Also, storytelling is really powerful. So SIO will help survivors and other people from the community create these 3-minute vignettes, these little, sometimes they're animated videos that talk about some aspect of the experience so that others can kind of listen and learn and relate. Mm-hmm. So for me, one of the videos was really helpful for me to kind of get some new pennies dropping to help me understand what happened to me. And that's really strengthening because we all need to know, for anybody who has experienced any trauma, and that's most of us, we need to know that we're not alone and it wasn't our fault, and that there's a community out there working against it. So it's got to be a 360 approach, but I think primarily within the communities, people just talking to each other and normalizing the conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That definitely makes sense. It sounds like a huge, huge part of the work. I'm wondering here how, yes, the advocacy, let's have the difficult conversations. I'm wondering how folks can work towards healing and how in that healing there is a space for pleasure. It's still May, it's masturbation month. And when I think about this, it's like, okay, well, masturbation looks different for everyone. And majority of the content that is put out there for people with clits, in heteronormative perspectives, for women as a whole, it's all about the clit. It's all about focusing your pleasure on the clit. It's all about, education and awareness of, your internal clitoris and how that's stimulated. And I wonder how, folks who have experienced FGM, folks who are survivors, how maybe providers like myself or on their own individually, how they can go about experiencing pleasure with their genitals with this procedure being done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I was so excited to talk to your class. There were over 100 people there who work in this field, and we need more people in this field who are getting comfortable to work with survivors of FGM, because it has been there's such a gap there. So I was so glad about that. So the way that I presented the topic was there's going to be a lot of similarities as to the work that you're going to do with anybody who has sexual trauma. Mm-hmm. So, all of those symptoms, just know that, there's a possibility of those being there. What's going to be a little bit different is, so sometimes survivors will go to a therapist or go to a doctor. And because this is an issue that most people haven't been trained in, you get a lot of bad responses. So you can get pity. You can just have misinformation. I saw a gynecologist who was trained in type 2 and type 3, but didn't know how to recognize type 1. And it was an invalidating experience for me. I was glad that I was so involved in activism so I could stand up to it. So it can be a really complicated experience. So I think if there are more therapists out there who know there's all these different forms, there's all these different feelings about it, it's going to be hard for people to talk about. You've got to deal with your own shock because initially when people learn about this, it's pretty shocking. So you sort of get that out of your system before you see your client. And then a lot of sex ed is also needed. So most people who have dealt with sexual trauma have learned some wrong messages about their bodies. Actually, everybody has learned the wrong message about their bodies. That's why we all need it, right?
Yep.
So, the most basic thing we can talk to survivors about is, get out a hand mirror, have a little look, know that your genitals are just fine, know that they're really complex, know that, most of the clitoris is internal, and that's great. So if you've got some external damage, there is the hope, right? That the rest will provide pleasure, but also know that there could be pain. Part of trauma is that pain can land in all different places and in confusing ways.
Yeah.
Right?
I love when you talked about that, just of how the nerves and from where the procedure was done, we might think that that's where things might receive some damage, but that no, everything's connected in the body.
Yeah. So it could be down the line somewhere, right? Yeah. Plus, if you experience sexual trauma, what's happening there is it's a huge boundary violation, right? That tells you that your body's not important. Your boundaries are not important. Your body isn't yours. You don't own it. It's for other people. And so, that can cause all sorts of things like over Kegeling, as a bracing, and then that creates pain. So you might not have been cut, lower down into the vaginal opening, but that's where it might hurt. So it's about have a good look and then learn about the anatomy, learn that there's so many ways to experience pleasure, talk to a therapist who knows stuff about that. Listen to all the podcasts about sexuality yours, I'm always learning. I have always thought that I was very sex positive. And every time I listen to a podcast, there's a moment where I involuntarily cringe and I'm like, what was that? Or
you're like, oh, I felt that.
Yeah. Or I didn't know that thing. I believed that thing, so we have to just open up this door that has been so shut for most of us. And that's a path to liberation.
Yeah.
But beyond that, beyond the sexual healing and, body and mind is all connected. I needed to do work around my inner child and, helping her understand that some of the ways that she understood those moments, because, trauma survivors will find ways to take blame because that's safer than blaming their trusted elders, right?
Yeah.
So being able to talk to my inner child about, no, that's not actually what happened. This is what happened. And was it your fault? So doing all forms of therapy help on all levels.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that I find I do a lot as a sex therapist, and I guess in some ways a sex educator, is reminding folks and helping expand their definition of sex, that it does not have to be genitally focused, that, not all of your sex has to be experienced through your vagina or even through your clit, that you can experience your sexuality throughout your entire body. And so like you're saying, yes, that takes some mind work as well and some body work as a whole, right? Because just because we experience trauma in one part of our body doesn't mean that other parts won't also be impacted. So yeah, doing that inner child work, I could see where that would be really, really key to connecting with yourself as a whole and having that healing. I'm wondering here how you do this column, which I think is so fantastic. And I'm like, yes, this is literally like the power of activism and of sharing your story and of being able to have these conversations to, on a micro level, impact the communities where this is happening, which is like basically everywhere, it sounds like. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this column and if there's anything specific that you do see come up over and over again that survivors are asking or struggling with.
Yeah, so it's called Dear Massi, and I've been writing it, I think, since September of 2020. And it's a monthly column, and it addresses sexuality and relationship issues. So some of the themes that keep coming up are about how do I talk about this with my partner? What if I'm not feeling any sexual pleasure with my partner? How do I deal with that? What exactly was cut is often a question. Like that came up twice. So SAIO did a study, and 65% of the survivors said that they weren't actually sure what exactly was cut. So that speaks to lack of sex ed, right? That you don't know. Yeah. And also sometimes there's not scarring that's totally visible. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there's not.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense because when you are 7, I don't know how much understanding typically folks have of their genitals. You learn this is my nose, my elbow, my stomach, like you
and
learn
then there's
all
down
parts.
there.
Yeah, there's my private parts. So yeah, that makes sense that, not necessarily even knowing the anatomy at a young age, which is also why like you can never start sex ed too early with children. Part of sex ed is also identifying your genitals, that when that's not there from jump, and then you experience a trauma with a procedure like this that, yeah, you might not fully understand, like, well, I don't know, what is it supposed to look like, or how is this supposed to function?
And even if you're not a survivor of any sexual violence, you might have those questions like, are my labia normal looking? Is my clit normal looking? What about the hood? Like, people can have a lot of shame about what their genitalia looks like anyway. So those are some of the questions. There was also an interesting question from someone who has been an out activist who was talking about how to date, because, when people are online dating, you'll get Googled. And if you have a name that is not so common, it'll come up as, FGM advocate. And then what are all of the myths that a potential date might have about you and your sexuality? Yeah. And in, one woman has talked about how she gets, 2 types of people who want to date her. The people who want to like save her and offer her sexual healing with their magic penises. We'll just cringe there for a minute. Yeah. And the other ones are people who are like, I think you're going to be too much for me. So, yeah.
I'm imagining as well that there's probably folks who also maybe want to like fetishize that in some way, or like, it's a novelty, almost like a, I don't know. I could see it being maybe fetishized in some way, or like people having that curiosity. So they just kind of want to like engage, but like don't really care to actually engage. They just want to be able to say that they have kind of a thing. Yes. I could see where that would maybe happen in dating too.
Yeah. So I think, there's been even questions about like vaginismus and so we've had a lot of questions. So people can just go to Sahiyo, SAHIYO.com, and look for the Dear Massi column. And there's a bunch up there.
Yeah.
And the last one I worked on was about shame, and how do I deal with the shame that has just kind of infused every aspect of my life. So again, no easy answers, but we can have the conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love that you do that column. I think that's like so powerful. And everything you shared in the presentation over the weekend was super powerful as well. I loved how you kind of were like, these were the things that were like helpful in my therapy experience. And these were the things that were not so helpful. And one of the things that was like not so helpful that you did touch on a little bit earlier, but that I think is extra important to kind of note here is, folks meaning well and trying to empathize and show support, but while at the same time kind of demonizing and vilifying the folks in the community and the practice itself as monstrous or as barbaric, and using this type of language that's actually like very harmful and high-key racist. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that piece as well.
Yeah, that happens a lot, the media, and I think it's just that everyone is so triggered, and, this is hard stuff to talk about. So yes, barbaric gets used backwards, gets used monstrous. And so, you're talking about my grandmother, you're talking about my auntie, you're talking about my mother, like, that's not helpful, folks, right? You're talking about the community that I love, that I'm a part of. Are we backward? Are we monstrous? No. In fact, in our own community, this is a community that has very high rates of education for women, and, lots of community support, interdependent community support in lots of ways, kind people, generosity. Men I've found in my community are very gentle and respectful. So you can't use those kinds of words. So it's about, cultural humility, asking questions. Sometimes I've heard people say, oh, I've heard that story for sure. Muslim men are horrible. And I'm like, you're talking about my brother. You're talking about my dad and my like, what the hell? Right. So it's not helpful. So, and it's much more complicated than that, as we've been talking about. So instead, you want to ask questions like, tell me what this means for you. Have you talked to other people about it? How do you feel about it? Where have you experienced negative impacts? How do you feel about your community today? Are you still connected? Just being very exploratory, I think, and realizing that every community has its crap, right? So tune into your own community's crap, and how would you want an outsider to talk about your community? You'd want them to understand nuance.
Yeah. Nuance that's key, and not a lot of people want to go there. And I think too, as you're saying, as we have talked about, like, yes, it does happen within these individual communities, but this isn't just a, practice in India. This isn't just a practice that happens in Africa. Like, this is a practice that happens all over. When I posted about kind of covering this topic, someone was like, oh, well, it happens in Asia. It's like, well, I'm wondering what kind of stereotypes or assumptions or perhaps underlying racism that's at play in that kind of storyline being told, right? So yeah, it is a lot to unpack. And one area I want to kind of leave us off on, because I remember from the end of your presentation kind of noting that oftentimes when you do talk about this, there's always someone that is like well, but what about men? And I know we've talked about circumcision a little bit, just kind of like similarities and, differences. But I think the way in which men get brought into this conversation of FGM is often to deflect from the actual issue and to kind of have like a oppression Olympics of like, well, but what about these people? And in a way is also just reinforcing patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Well, I just want to say bottom line, I think that circumcision on male babies is wrong and a human rights violation and harmful.
Yep.
And I also want to say that there are some people within that movement that will troll FGM activists. We'll post an article about FGM and they'll be like, if you're not talking about MGM too, then, you're doing nothing. Or like they're just really yucky. And some will even say, unless you address us, you'll never change FGM. And I don't think that's true. I think that in every community, you have to have a specific approach. So, culturally, in some communities, we are many years away from being able to really change hearts and minds about male circumcision, but we are getting so much closer to address FGM. So it can go, in that opposite direction. But I do see, FGM, male circumcision or MGM, and the unconsensual surgeries that happen to intersex folks as well. I do see it all kind of in the same category of body policing.
Yeah. It's human rights issue through and through of mutilation to someone's body without their consent.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I'm wondering how, maybe to kind of leave us off here, what care looks like for you as you do talk about these topics, given that you're not only kind of a professional expert in some ways and an activist, but also survivor of what it is like for you to have these conversations to talk about this and what your care looks like.
Yeah, it's a good question, because what often happens to a lot of activists is that they burn out pretty quickly because, this is not like an easy subject to talk about. And, some part of you, the victim part of you is going to be a little activated each time you're talking about it. And I think that's where doing your own emotional healing work can take you pretty far if you want to sustain yourself in this work. So what I found actually, as soon as I hit perimenopause about 8 years ago, I found that my self-care, my self-care game really increased in general because there was something that was happening to my body that I didn't understand, and I had no choice anymore. So I take it very seriously, and it's very embedded into my life. It's not perfect, of course, and it's always a work in progress, but I do think of self-care as like so important in this. So, one of the things I've paid a lot of attention to is understanding the stress response cycle, which is beautiful work that has been done by Emily and Amelia Nagoski and lots of other people that have talked about it, but they've sort of popularized it. So, after this discussion, I will probably get up and I will dance or something. Like you have to shake it out of your body, right? Peter Levine's work talks about that, how we just get stuck. Our stress gets stuck and we don't need it to be. So that's been one of my big self-care moves this last year when I've been doing a lot of talking about FGM.
Yeah, I love that. That's a big one for me in general is dancing, and like I need to move my body and I need to sing. I need to like vocally express it, get in touch with my chakras when I'm like talking about all of this stuff, and that's coming through this passageway. Like I need to vocally express things through song, and through music to really shake some of that energy and that intensity off.
Yes. We have to do it through the body because the body doesn't know that we're no longer stressed or, that whatever the thing is that bugged us is finished. The body does. And the body can't tell the difference between having an argument with somebody or talking about a difficult issue and being, chased by a lion. Yeah. The body doesn't know. So we have to help the body come down.
Yeah. Well, this has been so amazing. I so appreciate your space, your time, your energy, your knowledge, your experiences. I know we've mentioned a few times some of the work that you do, but was wondering if you could share a little bit about where people can find you, how they can, follow some of your work, where they can purchase your books, all of the information things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Farzana Doctor, and probably, from there you'll find everything in my bio that's there. My book is available in North America only right now. We're working on international rights. It's available in audiobook as well as ebook and book. I'm not supposed to say that, but that's what I think, book. Yeah, I'm pretty findable. So yeah, reach out.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all of this today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. I mean, part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.